Hey everybody, my name is Leighton Thorpe. I am in the INTS 4350 capstone class, and today I'm going to be giving my oral presentation over gun control and the gun issues that we are seeing in America today. Being that this is an INTS course, we're going to be looking at this problem, this very complicated problem, from three different perspectives. We'll be looking at it from a historical standpoint, a political science standpoint, and also look at the psychology behind everything. Along the way, I'll try to give some correlation of where these different disciplines agree with each other and also where they don't agree with each other. Hopefully, by the end of this, I'll have give you a pretty good understanding of what I have learned and where my position stands on this topic. So, without further ado, let's talk about the history of this country. This country was founded after King George started to put heavy taxes and heavy sanctions on the American colonies following the French and Indian War. And part of what he was trying to do, and one of the things that angered most of the colonists that people don't talk about, was King George actually started to take away the rifles of most of the colonists, especially the Brown Bess rifle, which was considered the most sophisticated military rifle of the day. This can be correlated with today's people's perception of the M4 or the AR-15 rifle, or what most people today call assault rifles. Now, having that we want our independence, our founding fathers wanted to make sure that no president, no legislative body could ever take away the rights away from the American citizens. That's why we have the Second Amendment, which we'll talk about later. But that is why such people such as Richard Henry Lee, who was the president of the Continental Congress, actually said, quote, "To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them." End of quote. So, from what we can first look off and consider from a historical standpoint, is that our founding fathers always wanted us to be able to maintain, to prevent there be a tyranny even based off of their own an attack from their own government. In fact, if we look at the Battle of Lexington, which started off the Revolutionary War, it started whenever the British soldiers actually tried to disarm the American citizens. So it's really interesting. What we saw back then is actually a large part of what we're seeing today. Legislative bodies are trying to disarm the American citizens, and that's exactly what the Founding Fathers did not want. Furthermore, that's all good and well to say to look at what the personal opinions is, but we also need to look at what actual proof do we have and what history can teach us. Back in the 60s and 70s, in Chicago and Washington, D.C., firearms of all types were banned in those two cities. There was the belief by the congressional bodies that if we took away the rights or took away the ability to own guns, then there would be no crime. It would lessen the crime rates. In fact, the exact opposite happened. We saw a considerable spike in violent shootings within that time period. Crime rates with the use of firearms rose exponentially. So really, history is actually not just from the wants and desires of our founding fathers, but also history also shows us that taking away rifles or firearms in general actually does not actually protect its citizens. So, and we'll add on to that a little bit more. So now moving on to my second discipline, I wanted to think about, okay, the laws, changing the laws, and right now everyone's talking about this Second Amendment. For those who don't know about the Second Amendment, it says that a well-regulated militia is to be, I'm sorry. It basically says that the rights of the American people are not to be infringed on, and that the American people should always have a well-trained militia. Now, the problem with that most people have is that term militia. Most people, when they think of militia, and those who are for gun rights tend to believe that means that we need to only think about the National Guard or the Army, that they are to protect us. And what's interesting is that according to Daniel Posby, who is a professor of law at the University of Northwestern, he has been quoted as saying, quote, almost all qualified historians and constitutional law scholars who have studied the subject, the overwhelming weight of authorities confirm the Second Amendment establishes an individual right to bear arms, which is not dependent upon joining something like the National Guard, end quote. Quote being brought from the Atlantic Monthly article of June of 1994. So really what this goes to show is that even scholars and lawyers and our lawmakers even have come to agree that the Second Amendment is not to just be for, say, the National Guard or even the Army or the armed services at all. It actually does extend to the American citizens. And with the case of United States versus Miller, this case actually went to the United States Supreme Court to see whether the Second Amendment does actually apply to individual citizens or not. And as it turns out, the Supreme Court at the time said that yes, this does apply to individual rights. So, according to, like I said, Daniel Posby and also the United States Supreme Court, the Second Amendment does apply to individuals as well. So now let's look at the psychological standpoint, because you can have history facts, you can have all the history facts, you can have all of the laws in place, but something that I've learned through training in the Army, something they talk about is winning the hearts and minds. That's something they talk about all the time. If you can't win the hearts and minds, you're never going to win the fight. You'll never win the argument. So what a lot of people believe is that if you do take away the guns of citizens, law-abiding citizens, everybody, criminals alike, that these criminals will even turn in their guns. And history has also shown that that's just not true. So from a psychological standpoint, we've seen, got off track. From a psychological standpoint, something I wanted to look into was something called the social learning theory, and it really does apply into this regard. And the basic premise of this theory is that what we read and see every day is what we're going to be pushed to learn and understand. So if all you hear every single day is that AR-15s are fully automatic, this and that, Hunter magazine clip, you know, what all the garbage that you keep hearing about and wrong information, people are going to tend to believe it. In fact, on January 13th of 2014, an anti-gun senator, Kevin DeLeon, made headlines by making multiple false accusations about the abilities of an AR-15 model rifle. The correlation between wrong information and the bad negative parts about any rifle is clearly making a negative impact on the rifles being spoken of and the gun owners who own them. So what this theory, okay, the social learning theory and how it applies here is, unfortunately, we're not hearing anything about, you never hear about citizens who are broke into and they use their weapons for self-defense, okay? Texas Tech recently allowed for concealed carry on campus. And luckily, nobody, as far as I know, has ever had to use it on campus, which I do thank the good Lord for that. But in the event that's a wrongful shooting or something like that, that would make headlines. But you don't hear about these big headlines when somebody uses their firearms to defend themselves. So all you ever hear is the really negative impact of gun owners. So as this theory has really shown us from a psychological standpoint, we're really, there's just a shrewd misconception about rifles. So now let's kind of talk about how we, where my three disciplines agree and disagree with each other. They agree foremost from a historical and a political science standpoint. Historically, our founding fathers wanted the American citizens to always have the rights to keep and bear arms. It's why they wrote the Second Amendment. So this really is one of the title and one of the anchor points for gun activists of why we should be able to keep our firearms. On the opposite side, where they don't disagree, is from a psychological standpoint. We keep hearing from lawmakers saying, hey, by the way, if we take away these guns, we're going to save lives because people won't be able to shoot each other because they won't have guns. But history clearly paints us a different picture. And so that's where we obviously are seeing disconnect. And I saw the biggest disconnect between my disciplines. In conclusion, where I want to finish off is I just want to point to the fact that this nation was founded and had the founding fathers that wanted its citizens to always have the right to protect themselves. You look at George Washington. He was quoted saying that a person should have the ability to protect itself even and use the firearms even against its own government. Kind of messed up. I mean, that's not the direct quote, but that was the meaning of it. And furthermore, the founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment. So they really felt that that was what was best for the American citizens. And then, unfortunately, from a psychological standpoint, we're just not seeing those issues being addressed. All we're hearing are the negative impacts. In closing, I believe America needs to start looking at the facts of the case. Guns do not, taking the guns away from people do not protect people. Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong of China all took away rifles from their citizens before they started the Nazi, or after Hitler started the Nazi Party, Stalin and the Communists, the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong the Communist Party of China. And they have, all three of them, committed mass murders against either their own people or people of another culture. And they all had their guns taken away. It's a terrible thought to think that the United States would ever turn on its own citizens. And most people just go, well, that's just absurd. And I'm sure that's what most Soviets and Chinese and even some of the Germans and much less all the other cultures that they sought after to wipe out. I bet they didn't think that they were up to that or they would go to those levels. But history shows us that sometimes it happens. And if that does, American citizens ought to be able the right to defend themselves. So that is what I have learned from this. It was very interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had always looked at this aspect from more or less just a historical standpoint. But being that this is interdisciplinary, I started looking at it from different disciplines. And honestly, I found that it has made my argument even stronger. Whenever I debate this argument with other people, I have a stronger foundation, and I can credit that to this class and making me look into this argument from multiple perspectives. So anyways, if you have any questions, or if you want to debate it, or if you think I'm completely right, wrong, whatever the case may be, I would love to debate it. So let me know, comment down below, and we'll see what we can do. I'll try to reply as fastly as I can, and otherwise, hope everybody has a good rest of your semester, and wreck 'em.